Now that you have a handle on the idea of federalism, it's time to move on to the next structure of government. To do so, we need to understand what institutions are involved in policymaking in our government. In particular, what governmental actors are involved in the policymaking process. This brings us to the idea of the separation of powers. In this concept, we try to understand how power is shared between the three main branches of government at all levels. In particular, we're concerned with the formal political actors in this political process. That means the legislative branch, the executive branch, and ultimately the judiciary. First, we're concerned with the legislative branch, the lawmaking branches in terms of government. At the national level, this is Congress. At the state level, these are the state legislatures. And at the local level, these typically are your city councils. Between the federal level and the state levels, we typically are concerned with the idea of bicameral houses. What does this mean? Two separate chambers or two separate bodies within the legislative branch. The only exception to this at the state level is Nebraska, which has a unicameral legislature, or one chamber composed of 50 senators. Why are we concerned about this? Because there are differences between the chambers, and these differences have implications for policy making. When you think of the lower chambers, or House when it comes to the federal level, there's 435 members. Typically these are larger bodies. They tend to act much faster than their upper chamber equivalency because they have strict rules to govern the behavior of those 435 or larger numbers of members. The upper chamber, or the Senate, typically have smaller numbers of members. They have fewer rules to govern them, and this translates then into a more slower, deliberative process. The splitting of authority between these two chambers, be it at the state level or the national level, has implications then for lawmaking. What does it do? Ask yourself. If you have two different groups of people trying to come to the same conclusion, does it take a long time or a little time to actually make that happen? Will they be the same on all issues, or will there be differences between chambers and further within chambers itself? The answer to all this should be it slows the entire process down. The goal here is to allow politics to enter at every stage of the policymaking process. The next branch, or formal actor if you want to think about it that way, is the executive branch, otherwise known as the law enforcing branch of government. The head of this branch is the president at the national level, the governor at the state level, and could be the mayor or even a city manager at the local level. Because they're heavily involved in enforcing the law, these executive actors are thus heavily involved in all aspects of the policy-making process before the law even gets to them. Beyond the head of the executive branch, we have a variety of executive agencies, or the bureaucracy if you want to think about that are involved in the law enforcing process. These include cabinet level and department level agencies, the ones we typically think about, like the Department of Agriculture, Department of Defense, Department of Education. Ones that are responsible for more focused policy areas, these independent executive agencies like NASA, CIA, or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And agencies which are insulated from the decision-making process, like the FCC and the SEC. Again, when you think about all these agencies, how does the makeup of them influence the system? Similar to their legislative counterparts, it slows the entire process down, all this division. Finally, we come to the judicial branch, otherwise known as the law interpreting branch of government. This three-tiered system of courts can be broken down into our trial courts, our intermediate court of appeals, and ultimately our Supreme Court. And because of the system of federalism we operate in, we do have a parallel system of courts at the state level operating in the same three-tiered structure. By hearing the cases that come before them and ultimately ruling on the decisions or writing their opinions, they create precedent for how a law gets enforced. This thus helps the executive branch to further interpret the law and further enforce it, and further helps the legislative branch to write new laws to overcome shortcomings in the current piece. Thus, when you think about the separation of powers, the form of government we establish helps to ensure that there is broad and balanced input into the policymaking process, but as we've seen across all three of the branches, it does slow the process down and complicates the policymaking process. Further, the balance of power between the states and the federal government or a federal system normatively can create better policy outcomes. It does create some confusion for the American public in terms of determining who's to blame for when policy goes awry.